Good evening, everyone. This is Cristina Campbell, and I would like to invite you all to listen to our tribute to the founder of Young Living. I would love to take full credit for all of the information that I'm going to be giving you tonight. I can take a lot of credit for it because over the years we've learned a lot about Gary. We've been with Gary. We've worked side by side with him. But I just don't know everything there is to know about him. There is a village of people who have brought together some of the pictures and the information that you're going to hear tonight. I believe that Gary would have us tell stories about what the oils have done for us, stories about what he did and the kind of person that he was. We would not have any of this if it weren't for Gary. He led us to 600 life-changing essential oils and oil-infused products. He found and distilled oils like Dorado Azul for the first time. And he compiled knowledge from the best of the best, and he applied it to our needs, despite everything working against him. I'm going to put everybody on mute. We're having a little scuffling. And if you need to say something, that's fine. All you have to do is unmute yourself. Okay, so despite everything that was working against Gary, the fear, the naysayers, the pain that he endured, the discouragement, his monetary limitations, he conquered it all. Even though he had little knowledge when he first started, he still pushed forward. If he didn't have the knowledge, he found someone who did, and he studied with them. So this class is a gift to a man that changed our lives forever. It changed my life because when I found Young Living 22 years ago and was suffering with something that's now called Gulf War illness. When I first got diagnosed, it was Gulf War syndrome. I would not be where I am today if it hadn't been for this man. And it's not that we idolize him or worship him or any of that. We are just so grateful. We are so grateful. And all he ever asked when he created these products, he had one simple instruction to those people who had gotten results from what he had given us. He said, bring oils to every home in the world. And that is the goal of everything I do. Every class I teach, every phone call I make. All I want to do is share the oils. If you have been changed by this man and the work that he's done for us, pick a script, sit down with a friend or someone that you love and read it aloud to them. You don't need to be perfect. Gary wasn't perfect. It took many, many mistakes to get the first drop of lavender. And I hope this class will accurately portray his journey. Gary has taught me that a person's impact can span the world, even if it is riddled with mistakes, if they do not quit and if they don't doubt. Gary's imperfections led him and us to a $2 billion a year company. And really, that blesses many people. But who was Gary Young? Let's talk about where it all began. To understand Gary Young, the founder of Young Living, you need to understand his roots. The majority of us were raised on processed foods and pharmaceuticals, and we had access to internet and cell phones, not in the beginning of my life, but many people that may be on this call or listening to this, depending on your age. But Gary grew up without electricity, without running water, no plumbing. He grew up in a very, very different world. It was almost as if he had stepped back 200 years. He lived off the land in the rugged West, and he was kind of like a real live mountain man. Yet he was also kind of a cowboy of sorts. He most definitely knew how to survive in the woods and how to treat animals with his compassion. I believe that his childhood laid the foundation of his convictions, along with a logging accident that forced him to look back to the earth for true healing, the type of healing that doesn't come synthetically. We're going to go on a brief adventure together through Gary's young life. And in this picture on the left, you can see him packing up and getting ready to leave. He was about 20, and he was leaving home, and he was going to go start his own ranch. He was going to carve out his own destiny. You cannot understand Young Living's Seed to Seal unless you understand the heart of its creator. Seed to Seal, the protective process of safeguarding components of plants, could not exist in the form that it does today without Gary's intuition and his conviction. His conviction came through his life experiences, and to understand those, you will also understand why every single ingredient in every single product mattered so much to him. Gary, you're going to understand, found it really, really important to source every ingredient. He didn't want poison in his plants, and he knew that he had to go to a place that was uncontaminated. Gary saw the world changing, and it was harder and harder to get unadulterated, hybridized wheat, oils, food, and water. And he saw that he had to get away from electromagnetic frequency, or EMF, those fields. The body is strong, and he believed that it would repair itself, but when it's bombarded daily with dreadful toxins, it becomes weak. So to find answers, Gary looked to the scriptures and to the plants that God had created. Mary once said that God was his foundation and his word was his bond. He called his Bible his owner's manual. Gary grew up in a 16 by 20 cabin, 16 feet by 20 feet. That is about the size of some people's room. That's about the size of this office. It's about 16 by 20, where I'm sitting right now. He grew up in the mountains of Idaho, and when he was 4, he migrated to a 30 by 30 dirt roof cabin with his parents and 5 siblings. 30 feet by 30 feet, and there's 7 people living in there. The cabin was about 12 miles from town, and it had no electricity, no running water. In fact, he did not have electricity in his home until he was 16 years old. His family also landed a hand-cranked telephone that same year, back in 1965. He had vivid memories of growing wheat that was taller than his own head on his father's ranch. I recommend that you grab the book, the best book ever written on Gary's life. It was written by his wife, Mary Young, and I'm going to show you a picture of it at the end of this presentation, but it's called D. Gary Young, World Leader in Essential Oils. I have 2 copies of it myself, and it's a picture book, and it has many of the pictures that I'm going to be showing you tonight. It has these 2 pictures in it for sure. This spectacular book will show you photos of his home, the ranch, and the wilderness where he grew up. And Gary had a life that most of us would not have had unless we were alive in the 1800s. It was just as if you would picture it from the olden days, filled with farming and fields and plants and animals and wilderness and seasons and tranquility, and a quieter place than you can find today, I'm sure. So in this slide on the right-hand side, you're going to see Gary with a set of crutches, because after he left his home as a young man to forge his way in the wilderness, an accident happened that changed the trajectory of his life. On February 8th, 1973, when Gary was only 24 years old, he was in a logging accident in Canada where he was forging out his future. What happened was a tree sheared off and fell on him, resulting in 3 open skull fractures, a ruptured spinal cord in 3 places, 11 ruptured discs, 16 broken or crushed vertebrae, a broken pelvis, a broken scapula, a severed brachial plexus, and 19 broken bones, including every single rib on his right side. He was confined to a wheelchair, and he was told that he would never walk again. He was on 13 drugs a day, including morphine and an antidepressant. Gary was so depressed because his life seemingly had been taken away from him that he tried to commit suicide twice, and he failed. He couldn't even get that to work. He was financially ruined because of his medical bills, and he lost his logging equipment, his ranch, and his livestock. His wife took the children and left, and he was unable to cope with the emotional burden, so he attempted suicide a 3rd time. This time, he tried to starve himself. And Gary went on the master cleanse, the lemonade diet, and drank only water and lemon juice and maple syrup and cayenne pepper for 253 days. Gary said that this was the lowest ebb in his life. It was when he tried to commit suicide and he failed, not once, but 3 times. He said, "I had no place to retreat to when I realized I couldn't even die. And never before had I felt so disconnected with God, my family, and the world. I had nowhere to turn. Had it not been for my father, who came to the hospital room, shaking his finger at me, who told me to grow up and quit feeling sorry for myself. If it hadn't been for him, I might have continued to wallow in self-pity, depression, and eventually succeeded in ending my life." Dad turned away and walked out, and he never came to visit me again. He made me so angry. I cried out to him, saying, "You don't know what it's like to be paralyzed and in constant pain with no drugs to help. If it's the last thing I do, I will get out of this bed and I will walk and I will ride my horse again." Have you ever been at this low of a point in your life? You will use oils knowing that the man that came up with these oils and distilled these oils had the very same feeling. Gary wanted to quit. Have you ever wanted to quit? What a world we would have if he had succeeded. After 2/3 of a year on only water and lemon juice, he was determined to take his life. He started to feel movement in his right toe. Doctors said that it was an unexpected medical phenomena where he literally ate so little that his body didn't have enough nutrients to manufacture scar tissue. So it allowed some of his damaged nerves to reroute themselves and reconnect. Gary stopped all medications so that he could clear his mind. And that was ultimately when he began experimenting with different natural remedies. And this grew in his knowledge. His knowledge grew with this of herbs and natural healing. It became a multi-year process of learning to walk again, and pain was something that he would live with for the rest of his life. Even before he passed, Mary said that the pain would get so excruciating in his legs at night that she would take all kinds of oils and she would just rub on his legs up toward the heart, just massage his legs. She said, "I would be so tired. It'd be 3, 4 in the morning. And he would just be moaning in pain. And I would get up and I would practically fall asleep on his legs, just massaging his legs up." But that was part, from the accident. Gary was never supposed to live to be almost 70. His injuries were far too severe. But after several years of plants and herbs and lemon and hydration and plenty of rest, he finally regained the use of his arm. It was time to rise. Gary had no way to financially survive, but he had one working arm now, and he started painting pictures and selling them. He painted murals from his wheelchair and on the office walls of lawyers and doctors. And when jobs began dwindling, he applied for a truck driver position to haul chips. The owner laughed, asking how he was going to drive a truck in a wheelchair. And Gary told him that if he could equip the truck with hand controls, he would drive it. It took over an hour, but he wheeled over to the truck and he pulled himself up into it, and he reached down and he pulled up his wheelchair and used the hand controls to drive the truck across the lot. The man hired him. Gary said that it was amazing how a feeling of wholeness started to just hover over me now that I was working again. This launched a period of recovery for Gary that I believe started his emotional healing. He needed purpose, and now he had it. He needed to find wholeness because there were others that were suffering that were not going to find the relief if he gave up. If he healed himself, he could heal them too, and he believed that. Gary moved to Southern California, and he enrolled in a naturopathic college. He opened an office, and there you see him on the left in his office, and built a research center for physical and emotional wellness. Through 13 years of pain, Gary went from a wheelchair to a walker to crutches to a cane and finally to painful walking. I would love to tell you that Gary used oils to learn to walk again, but the truth is that he didn't find the oils for more than a decade after his accident. He did, however, use plants and herbs as part of his healing protocol, and many of those herbs that he developed, put together, created, we still use today. Multigreens is one of them. Comfort Tone is one of them. Parafree is one of them. I mean, there's just a myriad of herbal supplements because he didn't know about the oils yet that he put together and we still use today, except that the difference in the things that he developed back then as opposed to today is once he found the oils, then he infused all of the products with the oils. And he was impressed on how much better they worked. People laughed at Gary, they slandered him, and they told him that what he was doing was impossible. So he decided that he was going to learn to distill. Because a woman from Switzerland, her name was Anne Marie, and she's still with Young Living. She had grown up working in the natural health products industry, and she eventually had her own laboratory and formulated her own health products. But she had been studying essential oils for several years, and she invited Gary to attend a conference in Geneva, Switzerland, to look at the science on essential oils and on the respiratory system. And I believe that I have the original book from that symposium, and there's a lot of really good scientific documentation on the use of essential oils and respiratory disease, whether it was with children or chronic acute respiratory. There's just a lot of research that has been brought together in that book. So once he was introduced to the oils, there was like some kind of switch that went on in Gary's head. It just flipped. And the first switch was when he realized that he still had a purpose in his life. The second switch was when he realized that he had the answers for his setbacks with plants. And the third thing became his introduction to the world of essential oils. And Gary's appetite for essential oils could not be satiated. Gary was invited by the French medical doctors to travel with them and to make rounds in their hospitals conducting research. And at that time, they were making some of the most authentic oils in the world. Not here in the United States by any means, but over there in France. So Gary traveled all over France, and he returned to America with 13 oils, and he began to experiment. At that time, there was not one single book written in English on essential oils. Now, they even have René Gattefossé book, The Father of Aromatherapy, in English. They translated it. But back then, they were all in French. So with no written information and no internet and no one with any experience, Gary began infusing his herbal supplements with those oils, like I mentioned. And again, he was so impressed on how much better they worked. So these 13 oils made a big impression on him. He already knew that they worked, and now he decided it was going to be time to make them himself. So Gary carried a backpack and a sleeping bag, and he flew to France. And the French had a history of being the best oil distillers in the world. He watched, he observed, he admired the fields and the distilleries from the road. Very few people spoke English, and he had trouble communicating. So his first trip was not incredibly successful, but 4 years later, after his first introduction to oils, Gary was lecturing at the Whole Life Expo in California. And this is where Mary met him for the first time. And I believe this is where Terry Seacrest met him for the first time. A man named Jean-Noel Landel was visiting from France, and he was hoping to find someone to sell his lavender oil to. So he saw that Gary was infusing his supplements with oil, and he invited him to his farm in France, not thinking that Gary would actually take him up on it. So a month later, Gary gets on a plane and he lands in Paris. And the meeting between the two men was truly, truly anointed. Landel's wife was American, and she spoke fluent English. So the two of them could understand each other, and she could translate. Gary showed the couple how to massage their little 6-month-old feet with lavender until he fell asleep. And Gary also taught them how to use Vitaflex that he had learned from Stanley Burroughs and the book of Stanley Burroughs' book, Age of Enlightenment by Stanley Burroughs. And Stanley Burroughs was also the one who taught Gary about the lemonade diet. But I don't know of anybody ever that had been on the lemonade diet for 253 days. That's a very, very long time. But again, Gary was like, it's either going to kill me or heal me, right? And it healed him to a great degree. But anyway, so he taught them how to use the Vitaflex and how to increase their technique arsenal by using oils. And what happened is it forged a lifelong friendship between the two families. The door was now wide open to young Gary for connections in France. And John Noel's son, Nicholas, the little one who had gotten that foot rub, now runs the Young Living Farm in Simeon-le-Breton in France. So a whole generation later, and he is in charge of that. Gary was, so it was John Noel who introduced Gary to Philippe Melhabel, and Philippe had a laboratory and opened Gary's mind to emotional uses of essential oils. He believed that oils carried a spiritual essence, not only a physical one. That influenced Gary to start teaching on oils for emotional healing. Gary was also introduced to a man by the name of Marcel Espiau. He's the man in the center of this picture with the dark blue shirt on, and Gary looking stronger than ever, sitting in front of him. And this was taken in France. Marcel Espiau was the president of the Lavender Growers Association in France. And Espiau was initially irritated at this American who had come to France and was asking all kinds of questions, way too many questions. But he eventually invited him to see his distillery. And Gary offered to keep the firebox burning all night. And Marcel came in the morning to switch positions. Gary's work ethic was what won the Frenchman's respect. And they became good friends. They did not speak each other's language, but they communicated through the love of their oils. Gary learned much more about distillation, and he had a passion to create his own distillery in the United States. Here are some of the pictures of Gary's very first cookers. We call them cookers. They've grown a lot since then. But, you know, even Marcel, the guy that was in the picture before, he laughed at him. And he kept saying the American that wanted to do what the French have done for hundreds of years. And Gary said, but once the dream was there, it was as though it had already been done. I mean, these are very tiny cookers compared to the largest cooker in North America, which is in Highland Flats. And I have a picture of that later. It holds 8 tons of plant material. But Gary had already forged 3 strong friendships from France. And there was one more person that he deeply wanted to meet. And his name was Henri Viard. And he was known as the father of distillation. So Henri had even tried to distill rocks to see if what they could give us. The trouble is that Henri was not open to having visitors, especially Americans. Gary was persistent though, and that's the kind of guy Gary was. He was going to find out come hell or high water. It took him 5 years, but one night, Henri came to John Noel's house where Gary happened to be having dinner with him, and he sat through the whole meal and he didn't even say a word to Gary. And at the end, he gave him a brief, intense interview. Gary answered the final question this way. He said, I believe essential oils are the closest physical substance on the earth that carries the spirit of God. Henri responded, you are right. And anyone that messes with them should be treated like a criminal. These are statements that Gary lived by. He believed that if you adulterated an oil, that was criminal. And I believe that it is. Because when we put toxic things on our skin or ingest toxic things, that is harming a life. That is criminal. When John Noel returned after seeing Henri out, he said to Gary, Henri wants you to come to the mountain at 6 a.m. Gary was there, and he spent many days cutting and harvesting lavender, thyme, and rosemary, and then distilling them. The days turned into weeks and months, and Gary traveled back and forth between the United States and France. Between Marcel and Henri, he had 2 of the best living teachers in the world to show him distillation. No one else does this. So the beginnings of the oil empires begin to form. And 4 years, Gary traveled all over France, studying. He and John Noel leased their first farm where he learned about planting and harvesting and extraction, and he drew plans. And at this point, he knew that he would have to have his own distillery. So Gary finally ended up in Spokane, Washington, where he purchased a 1/4 of an acre plot of land. He had smuggled lavender seeds from that field with John Noel in his boots and planted those seeds on that 1/4 acre of land. And the seeds grew into healthy plants, and they had an intoxicating aroma. Gary began his distilling by welding 2 pressure cookers together. Now today I did 3 more quarts of green beans, and I did 11 pints of pickled beets, and I have another 25 pounds of beets to do tomorrow. So I am very familiar with a pressure cooker. And yes, Sandy, my beets are done and you're going to get some. I see that little heart up there. Yeah, these are 2 pressure cookers on the left that he welded together to make them deep enough so that he could put his plant material in there. And then he would have water in the bottom that would go through a screen to steam. You don't want to boil the plant material. You just want to pressure cook it, basically. And then you should be able to get oil up through a gooseneck, a condensator. So anyway, he planted that lavender and it grew into healthy plants. And then Gary began his distilling after only 2 years of that lavender growing. The thing is that lavender needs to be at least 3 years old in order to get the plants, in order to get good oil out of it. But he couldn't wait any longer. He was like, I'm going to find out. It smells so good. This oil has got to be good. So he distilled it. He got about 3 milliliters of lavender oil. Now think about it. This is a 5 ml bottle. So he got about 2/3 of that bottle full of lavender oil. That's about a half a teaspoon. He had it analyzed by a really good friend who has done a lot of essential oil research. His name is Kurt Schnaubel, and he's actually German. And he started doing a lot of research on essential oils. And he contacted Gary after getting this sample and said, I am really impressed. Where did you get this oil? And he said that the quality of the oil was unprecedented. And Gary felt that that was his God nudge and that he needed to jump in 100%. And he did. So he tried distilling pineapple sage and then common sage and thyme in his little double cooker there. And all of these plants were grown on that little 1/4 acre in Spokane. And they were all grown from seed. They were eventually transplanted to the farm in St. Mary's. And here's the farm in St. Mary's. It's a beautiful farm. We now grow a lot of lavender and a lot of Melissa there. And I'm sure there's a couple of us on tonight that have been to St. Mary's. So he knew that he needed more land, and a plot behind an office building was just not going to cut it in Spokane. So he sold his truck and he purchased this 160 acres in the mountains of St. Mary's. This particular piece of land, this 160 acres, had not been plowed in 50 years, and it was virtually virgin land. 5 decades earlier, it had been used for pasture for cattle during the summer. He tilled tons of manure, microbes, enzymes, and foliage feed into the ground, bringing the pH of the soil from 4.5 to 7.5. He studied the soil. He knew what he needed to get it to. And he designed a Firebox boiler. And that's the one that you saw in the one, let's see, can I go up? The Firebox boiler is this one, I think. This is a Firebox, and that's going to boil that water. So let me go back. Okay. So he had a 250 liter distilling chamber, and the first official Young Living farm was finally launched. Gary believes deeply that if you see the farms, you'll see the roots of the company, and you need to be there to catch the vision. And today you can travel to St. Mary's. It's in Idaho. You can see the tractor that was originally used to till the first 160 acres of land. And it's just as silent today as it was in 1992 when it first started. In fact, you can see any of the Young Living farms. It was in Gary's heart that you could see what mattered so much to him. And he used to say, you can't grow oil if you don't know your soil. He had a lot of these little sayings. So peppermint oil was the first oil to be distilled at the very first Young Living farm. And Bob Skinner, the owner of the machine shop that made Gary's distillery cookers, said that there was so much excitement that Gary felt when there were just a few drops of oil falling from the spout into the quart jar when he was sitting on a tree stump. It was obviously a great triumph for him. So did you know that peppermint is native to Europe and is a naturally occurring hybrid of the watermint and spearmint plants? Did you know that peppermint essential oil's primary active ingredient, menthol, is extracted from the leaves and flowering tops of the peppermint tree? Did you know that peppermint is one of the oldest and most highly regarded herbs for supporting digestion? And just one drop of peppermint essential oil to an herbal tea can help soothe an occasional stomach upset. Did you know that if you're substituting peppermint oil for peppermint extract, substitute 1/8 teaspoon of Young Living per teaspoon of peppermint extract, and then add some more drops of oil until you're satisfied with the flavor. Also, did you know that it takes approximately 1 pound of peppermint plant to make 1 bottle of essential oil? And that Young Living's peppermint essential oil is roughly 4 times as concentrated as typical peppermint extract. So peppermint extract is a liquid alcohol flavored with peppermint. So essential oil versus 4 bottles of typical peppermint extract. He wanted to make sure that he had the plants that had the greatest nutrients, that were the most potent. And so the lack of nutrients was a big hurdle for him to overcome on this soil. There was not enough efficient water source to water 160 acres of land. So Gary contracted an irrigation company that looked at the lay of the land and said that it couldn't be done because St. Mary's is very rolling hills. And, you know, the contractor just said, no, you can't do it. So what did Gary do? He designed a 5-horsepower fire pump with a sprinkler head, and he made it work. And that was the way he was. He made it work without the irrigation company. He had to dig an entire pond on the property to collect rainwater and snow melt, and to have enough water to use for the 160 acres of peppermint that he had planned. And when there was a problem, guess what? Gary found solutions. His favorite problems were always the unsolvable ones. The first harvest from that farm came with many problems. He grew clary sage, and it was eaten by the deer. It was an aphrodisiac to them. Gary could not fight them organically, so he eventually moved all the clary sage plants to Mona in Utah. There's not as many deer there. Then the thyme plants weren't growing very well. And he realized that they were just sitting on the dirt because the gophers were eating the root system underneath the ground. Peppermint grew very well, but the grass around it did too. Because of the weeds and the cold, Gary also had to move the peppermint plants to Utah. Now St. Mary's is primarily used for what I was saying, Melissa and lavender, but primarily Melissa. It is still a working Young Living farm, and in fact, St. Mary's today produces 120 acres of organic Melissa annually, making it the largest Melissa oil production center in the world. One of the things that Kenneth learned about Gary was a saying that Gary had: if you're not living on the edge, you're taking too much space. And Kenneth would like to say something to that.
it's listening to his life being recapped, and
We can't see.
the times that I've had the opportunity to hang around him, to see how he interacted with everybody. Everybody was a friend as soon as you walked in. And he was probably one of the most authentic people that I ever ran into. And he had a sense of humor that was kind of quirky when he got going. But once you realized, where he was coming from, his take on it made a whole lot of sense. So I always wanted to be around him to hear what he had to say, because the stuff that he was talking about was always generated from the heart. That philosophy that he has mentored in the Young Living environment, that he wants these products because of the quality that he knows that's in it, and he understands that this is a blessing from God to him. And his point was to share that with all of God's children. And the way to do that is to have ambassadors, if you will, that have the same philosophy, that goes around the world talking about how you can do these things for yourself and for your family. So whenever I hear that saying, and it still cracks me up now, if you're not living on the edge, you're taking up too much room, it makes sense. Because even after he had a back injury, he was in his dune buggy one of the times that we went to convention. He's driving this dune buggy across the desert, and all of a sudden this thing takes air, and when I saw it leave the ground, I said, "Oh my God, this guy's got a back injury, and he's in the air about to slam back to earth." And it was just that popped into my head. If you're not living on the edge, you're taking up too much space. So
Kenneth learned that by going to the
Iron Will.
Yeah, and
Iron
tell him a
Will
little
Camp.
bit about that.
Well, the Iron Will Camp is a very, very interesting, and its origin is very interesting too. It's a camp in Utah in the Uinta Mountains, and it's very, very rugged. And you think back to the description of where Christina said Gary started when she was talking about that Skyrider Ranch, wilderness ranch, got it, because it's certainly a wilderness. Um, it's so remote that when you get there, if they hadn't, it had been a resort at one time. They had a huge lodge there, and then they had what they call bunk houses, and that's where the people who came up for the Iron Will Club stayed. So you had, depending on when you registered, you were placed in one of these places, and then you'd walk between the bunkhouse and the main lodge, because all of the training and stuff took place in the main lodge. But it was one breathtaking place. And another instance at that particular time that brought that phrase to my mind was they had these side by side, like the what do you call it, the dune buggy kinds of deals. Well, there were 8 of them at the Iron Will
They're
camp.
kind of like razors.
Like razors, yeah, but most people don't know what a razor is if you're not shaving. Um, so Jacob, his oldest son, was a spearhead of a trip in the mountains in these side by sides. And I took my camera because I thought I'd get some fantastic pictures of the ranch from above. Well, little did I know that the speed that they were going to be going through these mountain passes did not bode well for you taking your hand off of something that would keep you inside that vehicle. And following Jacob, when he would make turns and I see the rear end of the razor that he was driving sliding toward the mountain road edge, and I'm saying, oh my God, if something happens to this kid up here, we're going to have some real tough times to explain this mess when we get back. But when we got back, Jacob jumps out of the little vehicle, turns around and said, "Who want to go again?" And I looked at him and I said, oh my God, if you're not living on the edge, you're taking up way too much space, even for his kid. So it's just the things that he's about. I really admire. And it's just when you find somebody that's down to earth and willing to invest himself in making sure that you get the best out of your existence, it really, really bodes well for me.
So let's talk about some other victories that Gary had on the farm. First of all, Gary designed a conveyor system so that when the plants were harvested, they were dropped directly into the truck that took them to the distiller. And in the case of the trucks where we blew the chips in Idaho, in Highland Flats, Idaho, that conveyor belt actually got the chips out of the truck. We still had to, because they'd freeze, because we were harvesting in January and February and in 29-degree weather and below. The chips and needles, pine needles, spruce needles, fir needles would freeze solid. So we'd have to go in and chip all of the plant material so that we could get it on the conveyor belt so that it would pull it out of the truck. And then we'd scoop it up with little skidders and then put them in the cookers. He also built the first real stainless steel stationary vertical steam distiller. This distilling design was so innovative that the method is now copied worldwide. Gary constantly modified heavy equipment and in many times completely redesigned new harvesters that would keep up with the volume. At the beginning, it was a one-man show, and Gary did the marketing, the speaking, and all the raising of the crops. Can you imagine? So Gary figured out little tricks to increase production by 5 times. He gathered bits and pieces about each plant, which worked and which didn't. The information went into a Young Living library, the largest library of constituents that is now over 30 years old and covers over 300 oils and blends, making it the largest oils library in the world. Gary did extensive greenhouse research. He started a project with organic enzymes and soil nourishment in 1996. And he found that if he tested the sugar of the plant with a Brix instrument to see where the levels were highest, that told him when to harvest his crop. Nobody else was doing that. Gary treated the plants with frequency, and that kind of sounds a little bit bizarre, but the plants responded. The plants that were treated with higher frequency had longer and stronger root systems. And Gary photographed and chronicled what he saw, and he added this to the Young Living Library. He also studied worm casings. We have a huge worm farm in Ecuador. And there's one man that's in charge of that entire worm farm. And it's amazing the number of worms that they create, right?
Yes, tons of them.
Yeah, Kenneth was talking to the guy that ran the worm farm last year. So he also, and he learned that the worms were going to aerate the soil better and feed the soil better. So Young Living's oils are the best because of how they are meticulously cared for and the type of food that they're fed through the soil. Gary would grow a plant at one farm and then he would move it to the next or the next until he found the perfect spot where the deer didn't get them, and eat them as aphrodisiacs, right? Records were meticulously logged on all 300 essential oils and blends through thousands of hours of trial and error. And nothing was handed to Gary Young. Not his distilleries, not his equipment, not his land, not his research. One farm became a dozen farms over multiple continents. We've got a farm, a Young Living farm on every continent except Antarctica. In Europe, we're in France, Croatia, and Spain. In the Middle East, we're in Oman. In South America, we're in Ecuador. In North America, we're in the United States and Canada. And we're in the Philippines, and we're in Taiwan. We're just all over the place. Sarah Harnish wrote most of what I'm sharing with you tonight. And she said that when she traveled with Gary to Mona, Utah, St. Mary's, Idaho, and the Finca Botanical Farm in Ecuador. Also, she traveled to the Helichrysum Farm in Croatia, or she's been up to the Northern Lights Black Spruce Farm at Fort Nelson in the Canadian tundra. Kenneth and I have not been to Croatia or at Fort Nelson. But Gary was always up at 4 or 5 in the morning, and he was the last to go to bed. He worked harder than all of us. I want to mention that when Gary was about 60, I had been working at Northern Lights, at the Highland Flats farm, and I was the cook. I fed the people, and I also went out in the field and harvested trees and worked in the distillery as well. But my main job was cooking for everybody. And I had a couple of people that helped me. Gail Stafford, you see her on quite often, but she's out of town this weekend. She helped me cook. But one of the things that really, it's the little things about a person that speaks volumes. I had gotten up at 5 in the morning to use the restroom, and I knew that I had to get the fires going in the kitchen because we cooked all of our food on wood stoves. We didn't have any electric stove or gas stove. We actually had the old time where you picked up the plates with the handle, the bar, and then stoked the wood stove and then put the plates back down, and then we cooked on top of that. I actually baked cakes in that wood stove. I got pretty good at it, but I have to say that I was good at it because Gail knew more about it than I did. But anyway, I got up and I heard somebody chopping wood. And I went around the corner of the cabin, and lo and behold, at 5:30 in the morning, the only other soul that's up is Gary, and he's chopping kindling for me. He is the CEO of a multi-million-dollar business at that time. Now it's billion. And here he is chopping kindling wood for me, for the kitchen, not specifically for me, for the kitchen. It was just amazing. Just amazing. So what happened next after Young Living's first farm? How did everything else arrive? How did Young Living become a $2 billion a year company with hundreds of oils? It literally happened one drop at a time. From the help of each and every volunteer, from every single wow moment, and from all of the perseverance. You see, when we went to harvest, we didn't get paid. In fact, you couldn't pay me enough. I was going to go to harvest to volunteer, to help, to watch how our oils are made, to see the proof in the pudding. It would take a great deal of time to log every victory and every loss that Gary had. There were far more losses than victories, and this is something that we need to remember in our own life. It was a bit like watching Thomas Edison invent the light bulb. You know, he had 1,000 failures before the bulb was ever lit. But just as it did for Edison, it ended well for Gary too. With a $2 billion oils company that continues to bless millions of people, I can't even imagine living without Young Living. Before it all happened, it was hard to even imagine a world with Young Living unless you were Gary Young. He always saw things well before they happened, and he sought out an unusually large number of adventures, as Kenneth alluded to. He had a vision despite a long list of adversities. It is And if not for that vision, we would not have Young Living today. When people tell you no, when they don't believe in the oils or in the power of food, or when they think that your lifestyle is a farce, I want you to remember Gary's story. And sometimes you're going to have to take a few steps back from those that speak death over you and look above over their heads. Look at what you see in your own head. The Lord plants visions in us that we are meant to carry out. And when we ignore them, then the negative has victory over us by our silence and our fears. So let me wrap this up with a few highlights of how this company grew in 1993 to where it is today, and then we'll end up with the spirit of Gary Young. And when you read things about him online, or you hear stories from people that have never met him, I want you to remember the stories of those of us who did know Gary. It's always easy to judge someone else's dream. But the reality is that millions of us benefit from Gary's dreams every single day. He, for me, is that mentor that we look for our entire life. He set the example. He not only talked the talk, he walked the walk. They happened because what Gary did happened because he didn't listen to naysayers. Stay away from negative people. Cynthia and I just talked about this on Sunday. We don't have time for negativity. If you can't say something positive, please get out of my way. And she's saying amen under her breath. So from 1999 to 2021, it all comes together with, guess what? These oils work. These oils work, and they work because God made the plants. And no one else can take credit for what they do. Nobody, not even Gary. Gary Young was innovative, and I believe that the Lord dropped nuggets of Solomon wisdom on him and spoke to him to give him the understanding to distill. But the oil that comes from frankincense resin and the rind of the macerated lemon, no one can take credit for that but our Lord and Savior. He made the trees, he made the leaves, he made the flowers, and he made the rinds. And Gary gets the credit for being obedient and for always listening. When he did not know what to do, Gary went to the mountains and prayed. He fasted. The mountains were his sanctuary. The mountains were his church. And that's where we got the oil Sacred Mountain, one of the most fabulous oil blends that Gary ever made. And it's been around for about 24 years, that oil. He used to call the mountains God's living room. And he went there to be near the plants and to drown out the noise of the world. So what happened after the first farm? Gary received specialized GCMS or gas chromatography training with Dr. Herve Casablanca. He was a highly trained analytical chemist for essential oils who helped write the AFNOR standard to measure oil's authenticity in France. He became a mentor to Gary and he taught him how to test. And Young Living has never stopped doing third-party testing, but Gary also wanted to know for himself that his plants were unadulterated. So Dr. Casablanca came to Young Living Labs to calibrate the equipment, to set it up, and to test the equipment. Gary and Jean-Noel purchased a lavender farm with virgin land in Simeon-le-Rotrand in France, and the French farmers nearby were nearby, but told Gary that feeding and nourishing the soil will produce better quality oils. And Gary noticed that the lavender plants in France were starting to die. He believed it was because their immunity was weakened after years of growing with fertilizers and spraying with pesticides. I remember when this happened, we were out of lavender because I think it was 80% of the entire amount of lavender on the market had come from France, 80%, and about 80% of that lavender was destroyed through a blight or virus. So when the virus hit the crops, it hit the crops all around Simeon-le-Breton. It didn't affect Gary's soil. So we had lavender, but the price went sky high because there was so little of it. Then a severe drought hit and struck France for 7 years. Gary was able to bring some of his original unsprayed French seed from America to help repopulate the fields that had been destroyed and owned by the other farmers. Do you know what the other farmers thought of Gary when he did that? Now their fields had strong crops again. They were ever so grateful. Gary moved the Young Living Essential Oils Company to Riverton, Utah, and he rented an 8,000 square foot office site where he purchased another 160 acres of unadulterated land in Mona. And at this point, there were already over 100 different oils, singles, and blends, and 5 kits. Within a year, Riverton became too small, and Gary had to move to a 40,000 square foot elementary school in Payson, Utah. The cafeteria, where the warehouse and the gym became the actual shipping department. So plants were started in Mona, and then they were transported to nearby farms. And over 3 million lavender plants were transported to St. Mary's alone. Gary also added 12,000 liter chambers of distillation in Mona. 12,000 liters. So that's in Mona, that's 2.5 tons. That they hold 2.5 tons of plant material. Chickens and pigs and mice were living in the current visitor center on the property, and Mary and Gary said one day that this farm will be a destination for people all over the world. And that original building, we just learned at convention this year, 2 weeks ago, that it has been destroyed and rebuilt with I think it was 8,000 square foot new visitor center and training and education hall. And it's beautiful. They showed pictures of it at convention. So Gary has learned a lot about organic farming. Seeds are never genetically modified. The composting was done to increase nitrogen and feed the plants at Young Living's farms worldwide. Weed control is done primarily with an organic herbicide made from neem oil, castor oil, and a host of essential oils. That's what he uses as an herbicide. Gary found that the spray also dramatically improved the organic environment of the plants. Soil sprayed with essential oils has been shown to digest unwanted chemicals. Also, during his quest for the perfect superfood, Gary found the wolfberry upon meeting Dr. Chow, who was a Chinese scientist and head of the science department of Beijing Technical Institution. This was a huge breakthrough for so many of our supplements. Ningxia was developed from this wolfberry, and Dr. Chow's daughter, Sue Chow, who I was able to meet, she was a biochemist working at the University of Utah, ultimately came to work and was part of our research team managing a laboratory for Young Living. Gary also started his research then on frankincense. And he found the most powerful frankincense was being cultivated in Oman, but they weren't distilling it. So he was able to win the support of the Omani government, who wanted to help Gary bring Oman back to its rightful place as the frankincense capital of the world. So Gary followed the frankincense road to research the history of the world's most famous essential oil, traveling to forbidden and dangerous places like Yemen and Somalia. He was gifted, get this, he was gifted 3,000-year-old incense burners from the Minister of Antiquities in Yemen, balm of Gilead, and sacred frankincense trees for the gateway to the Young Living Distillery in Oman. You can see these frankincense trees. They have to be at least 40 years old before you can tap them. This was his negotiating for his first distillery in Oman. And then they took the sacred frankincense that is grown predominantly there, and they started testing it. And this was the test that H.K. Lynn, Gary Young, Cole Woolley, Dr. Sue Hale, and a couple of other people that I'm not familiar with. I know all those people that I just mentioned. They did the research on here, and Washington University here in St. Louis peer-reviewed that, and it was published in, you can see here in NCBI, NLM, NIH, Natural Institute of Health.gov. It was published December 16, 2011. And it was effective against stage 4 breast cancer. It killed the cancer cells within 24 days, not touching healthy tissue. So he was part of that research. He also began research on an unhybridized ancient grain called einkorn, and he purchased what came to be the Skyrider Ranch that Kenneth was talking about. And Kenneth made little bookmarks, I don't know how well you can see this, out of the einkorn from the Skyrider Ranch.
And that is Skyrider Ranch.
And this is a picture that Kenneth took of the Skyrider Ranch around it, and then the einkorn fields in front of it. And how many of these do you have left?
About 15.
He has about 15 left, so maybe you'll get one someday from Kenneth. Maybe he'll pop one in the mail to you. He also launched a farm in Ecuador and had to tame the Amazon rainforest to cultivate ylang-ylang, ocotea, oregano, eucalyptus, Palo Santo. That's what he's got in his hand right here. Palo Santo stands for holy wood, and it smells so wonderful, and much, much more. The beauty of this farm literally takes our breath away. We have been there a number of times. We love it there. It also became the beginning of the Young Living Foundation. Here is Gary and his ylang-ylang trees. You see the ylang-ylang flowers on the Ecuadorian farm. He's smelling that ylang-ylang, and he taught us how to know it's when it's supposed to be picked, because it's almost like dogwood, where it has that drop of blood in the center. That's what ylang-ylang has. It has a drop of maroon in the center of 4-petaled flower. So Gary opened a new school for the local children to attend down in Ecuador, and he found that they were walking each day to a one-room schoolhouse with a broken chalkboard and no bathroom. 42 first to sixth grade children were crammed into one tiny room, and they were forced to share supplies while sitting at broken tables. The teacher was a volunteer. Gary doesn't just go into a town and plop a farm down and leave. He works hard to make the lives of everyone living there a little bit better. So he began the Young Living Foundation that began in Ecuador, and now partners with a number of groups, including Goals for Girls, Soul for Hope, Hope for Justice, Rebuild Nepal, and in 2019 alone, 219,809 people were empowered. $5.5 million was raised, and 100% of the money that was raised was given to these organizations. $437,661 in Young Living products were donated to those in need, and 129,094 jiggers, which is a painful flea that burrows into the skin, were removed by Soul Hope staff, helping 10,549 people in Africa walk. Oh. There were 10,694 people treated and saved from malaria in Uganda. And Mary Young opened a new lighthouse in Uganda for girls who have been victims of exploitation. $170,000 was donated to the disaster relief efforts from fires in the Amazon rainforest and hurricanes in the Bahamas and Texas. And that is the heart of Gary Young. To know more about the foundations, you can go to younglivingfoundation.org. So we could all go several more hours about Highland Flats in Idaho and the Northern Lights Black Spruce Farm and building in the dead of winter, in the dead of winter, in the Canadian Arctic, to restock our very own Valor oil, the launch of Heliochrysum in Croatia, the growing of the Balm of Gilead in Israel, and the launch of the Seed to Seal Partner Farms. Each one of those farms was launched with tremendous adversity, and yet Gary carried on. He actually garried on. In the beginning of this story, it was much like the end. He was a fighter. He was a trailblazer. The oils whisperer, he's been called. When something works, it spreads, and the oils work. And word of mouth advertising is what launched this company back in 1993. Now there are over 6 million people globally using Young Living oils. Over 50,000 bottles shipped from the warehouse in Spanish Fort, Utah daily. Oilers reorder every single month because they get the results. And if you can use a plant instead of a synthetic chemical, that's a better choice. Gary didn't need to defend the word of God or the work of God. Gary is pretty good at defending the stuff that he made all on his own. I mean, God is, not Gary. God is pretty good at defending everything that he made all on his own.
I thought that was a...
Yeah, thank you. Gary was humble, and he gave all to help other people. I have some pictures of him and his family. You know that Mary was 54 years old when she had her first son, Jacob. She had never been married before. She got married 4 years before I came into Young Living. Here's their wedding pictures. I know it's a little small, but they were a love made in heaven for sure. And I remember the days when Jacob and Joseph were this small on stage. And they would let them on stage. They would run back and forth on stage. There'd be 2,000-3,000 people attending convention, but Gary and Mary didn't care. They were allowing their children to be who they were. And so I just wanted to share those family pictures with you. This is the distillery in Mona. This isn't a very good picture. This is the cooker, the largest cooker in the world, in Idaho Flats. And you can see me standing in this 8,000 ton cooker. And that was probably 10 about 10 years ago now. And one of my very best friends, Gail Mack, and another good friend, Mary Hardy, and Casey and her sister Susan, and Gary right there in the middle of it all. Gary was an amazing, amazing man. He was a pioneer. He loved his horses. He was a maverick. And he was a shokunin. Now, what in the world is a shokunin? It's an oft-quoted expert. It is the Japanese word for craftsman or artisan. But such a literal description does not fully express the deeper meaning of shokunin. The Japanese apprentice is taught that shokunin means not only having technical skills, but it also implies an attitude and a social consciousness. The shokunin has a social obligation to work his or her best for the general welfare of the people. This obligation is both spiritual and material, in that no matter what it is, the shokunin's responsibility is to fulfill the requirement. The shokunin's spirit is a collective virtue in the end. And I pray that all of us would have that same spirit. I want to share with you a few books that I have found extremely inspiring and educational through my journey with Young Living. Gary wrote One Gift. It's a novel, but it is incredible on the frankincense trail. There's also his little companion guide, Healing Remedies from the One Gift, Ancient Shutron's Ancient Apothecary, and of course the Essential Oils Desk reference. And if you want to know more about Gary's life and the growth of the Young Living essential oils with its worldwide farms and its philanthropic endeavors, they're all chronicled in this book. This book will take you into Gary's world where you're going to learn his triumphs. I just tapped the surface tonight. And his trials, including his journey back to walking again following that devastating logging accident. And this amazing book is the account of a man who followed his dreams, persevered through many hard to imagine trials, and shaped a company that is impacting countless numbers of lives throughout the world. You can learn about the life and passions and achievements of D. Gary Young by getting this book in your virtual office. Just go back there and shop. You're going to find there's two different prices. The one on the left is $19.95, I think, and the one on the right is a little bit more because one of his favorite oils, or I think it was the oil that was released at his death, if I'm correct. It's called Journey On, or he developed it just before he died or something. But Journey On is really, it's kind of like when Gary passed, he was journeying on. And he is asking us to journey on as well. So I know that, I've spent quite a bit of time, but I think that it's important that you understand the founder of our company, the roots of our company, what makes our company so different from any other company on the face of this planet. I am grateful. I'm grateful for everything that Gary did and for the plants. I'm grateful to God for allowing me to open my eyes and see that this was there, that a man was developing all of this stuff for me and you and everybody else, everybody that we're supposed to get these oils in their homes to. So join me to make this happen, make it possible that we get oils in every home. I wanted to tell you what next week's class is, but as usual, I've got my calendar here. I'm going to open it up for any questions. I see that we have quite a few chats. Yeah, this is what a leader does. He shows us how to lead. Isn't that correct? Yeah, I love this stuff. Okay, so I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to stop